Hi, I'm Edward Funk, and this is podcast number 40. Title is Loretta Young's Reaction to Her Daughter Judy's Bruising Tell-All Book. Now, it just occurred to me, um, we've been doing a bunch of podcasts about Loretta Young, but if you're under the age of 70, there's a good chance you don't really even know who she was. Uh, she was a major motion picture actress. She made 98 movies. She was the first actress to win a Best Actress Oscar and then a Best Actress Emmy for television. Um, she's absolutely gorgeous. I encourage you to uh, go online, put her name, and then images, and then you'll see what all the shouting was about. Okay, now on this podcast, I'm plugging this book, Loretta Young and Me, because that's where this material is coming from. But um, and it's a book I wrote. I'm the me of me, uh, but there's so much more there than what's being discussed in the podcast. So if you're finding this captivating, hopefully you'll go on Amazon and order that book. Okay, so let's get started for today's podcast. Now, a few months before the publication date of Judy's book, which was called Uncommon Knowledge, Loretta was predicting that Judy wouldn't go through with it. Now, this was irrationality on a new level. And Loretta was a very rational person. From my insured paid in advance, and the book was written. What could Judy do even if she wanted? And there was no reason to believe that Judy wanted the project to be halted. So when Judy's book, Uncommon Knowledge, was published for Mother's Day, 1994, Loretta had set herself up for a major crisis. I read the book. Initially, Loretta had no interest, or more aptly, no stomach for reading it. She kept saying, I can't believe it. The child I was protecting is the one that's telling everyone about it. I thought Loretta was sincere, but I also knew that it had been herself as well that she had been protecting from a scandal. This is a scandal in her mind that was 59 years ago, a situation that most people no longer saw as a scandal and really hadn't for decades. Now, I persuaded Loretta to read the book. She got 100 pages into it and became sick to her stomach. She didn't go any further. However, she read far enough to conclude that Judy was playing loose with the facts, such as Judy's description of a visit she'd had with Gable and her mother. Now, Judy described the scenario as her coming home from school one day. I think she's like maybe junior high age, and finding her mother and Clark Gable in the living room. Now, her mother disappeared, leaving her the opportunity to visit with Gable for a couple of hours. It was a warm, friendly visit, and Gable cuffed Judy's chin as he said goodbye. That would be the only time they would meet. Now, it's a lovely story, but Loretta denied it ever happened. Loretta said that Gable had come to their home one time for a business meeting regarding the 1950 movie Key to the City, in which they co-starred. Loretta then escorted Gable to their pool where Judy was swimming with friends, including Irene Dunn's daughter. Uh, and they all giggled at meeting the king. So let me interject something here. By this time, I had known Loretta Young very well for 4 years, and I'd never caught her in a lie. Now, there were times that she was mistaken, but that's another matter entirely. And I don't think it would have been possible for her not to remember the scenario that Judy described in her book as the whole Clark Gable secret baby saga had been a defining chapter in her life. And something else I'll just throw in here. I believe this is true. I think Judy had the same editor that Christina Crawford had. She wrote a book, Mommy Dearest. So it kind of gives you an idea of what kind of book they were going for. Now, back to Loretta. After she had read portions of Judys book, Loretta now realized that I have to address the story of her and Gable and the book that I was writing with her. One day, she handed me a note. It was written on the back of a Kodak box lid, and it was her suggestion of what the author, me, should write regarding Judy Gable, the Judy Gable saga. Okay, now this is what I was supposed to write. I don't think hurting her career per se ever entered her mind. I do think, from those who knew her intimately at the time, that adultery, spreading scandal, giving bad example were very much on her mind, and that's the reason she chose to exercise her right to privacy, to take the position, it was a rumor then, it's a rumor now, it will always be a rumor. Okay, now here's a note for me. How does one reconcile the story that Gable actually date raped Loretta with her discussion of being, she had some kind of sin on her soul because of all this? Now, I think I know. Loretta had an archaic view of the battle of the sexes, and that if a man ultimately scored, it was the woman's fault because it was her responsibility to see that that never happened. So, in other words, Loretta loved being a tease, and she loved having all these men fall over her. But as long as she could keep them out of bed, what's the problem? Even if they were married. So, I mean, her thinking was entirely pure in all this. But going back, I think I know why she thought that this was a sin, because ultimately she wasn't able to prevent it. Okay. Now, one night in Palm Springs, in Loretta's Palm Springs home, if still unwilling to go into details of her relationship with Clark Gable, Loretta was open to discussion how Judy's book had affected the relationship between the two of them. Loretta recalled the phone call during which the book was first discussed. Okay. Loretta, one day Judy called me and said, I've just been offered $100,000 to write my story. I asked, well, what story? She said, oh, my story with you, and and it could be so wonderful, so romantic. I said, if you're asking my permission, you don't have it. We discussed it a little while, and I said, well, that was my mistake. We all do things that we're not proud of. Some of us do worse things than others. This was mine. I've already gone to confession and been forgiven. Now, there's no reason why it should become a public scandal, a public disgrace for everyone connected with it. At the time, Judy seemed to understand and was sensitive to my feelings on the matter. My position has never changed. As far as the world is concerned, it's none of their damn business. Loretta continued, I'm having a hard time reading Judy's book because it breaks my heart. I can't believe the misrepresentations, the phony psychology I hear in all the stories that she makes up, and then assigns motives to people for what they're doing. She couldn't possibly know what was in other people's minds, particularly when she was 5 years old. I mean, complete fabrication of stories that just never happened. Never happened. Now, I don't know why I'm reading this book. I think it's because you have to look at the dead body to see that it's all bloody. And at the point, it's not the book. The book really can't hurt me. My career as Loretta Young is far behind me, so it can't affect that. But Judy, she has hurt me. She has destroyed my trust in her, and that's what I'm grieving about more than anything. Now, I haven't spoken this openly with my family. She's referring here to her sisters, because I don't want to hurt them any more than they have been. When they call, I'll say, oh, I'm just fine, don't worry. But this has probably been the most difficult thing I've ever faced in my entire life. Now, in all the years I knew Loretta, uh, she was the most vulnerable that evening, that evening in Palm Springs. I can still see her sitting in her desk chair, turning towards me as I sat on the sofa. John Louis' dog, Theta, was sitting at her feet, which was strange because Loretta didn't particularly like her, uh, and Theta didn't like Loretta. It was as if the little terrier sensed Loretta's sadness and was commiserating. Now, most important for me that night was Loretta's declaration that I was her best friend. That was the only time she would say that to me. And even then, I put it in perspective. She had lifelong friends, since as Josie Wayne, John Wayne's first wife, that we've talked about a number of times in these podcasts. But for some reason, I was the one who she felt comfortable sharing her most intimate feelings. Even at that, Loretta was unable to open up and let the Gable story flow. I think she still thought she'd be putting her soul in jeopardy. Instead, she told me, I have no control over what others might tell you. By this time, I knew Loretta well enough to translate this to mean you can go to Pollyanna and Sally and get what they know. Those are her two older sisters, or were her two older sisters. Now, I called both Pollyanna and Sally, quoted Loretta, and scheduled interviews. I saw Sally first. While Sally was often high-strung, that afternoon she was extraordinarily so. We were sitting at her dining room table, and at one point she picked up some papers uh, I had laid down, and she threw them at me. And she's saying, how can you ask me that question? Now, I wish I remembered the question, but I don't. However, I do remember thinking the reaction was far out of proportion. Pollyann was always more even-tempered, and so was our meeting. From these two encounters, I would learn much of what I was initially able to write about the Gable Judy saga. In the book, their comments. Sally. What the hell choice did Loretta have? If she were my child, I would have wanted her too. But it's been very hard on Loretta, very hard all the way through. Working so hard to support everyone and putting up with Tom, that's Loretta's husband and father of her two sons, and trying to smooth the way for Judy. Who would believe that would be the daughter, the child, who Loretta was protecting, that would drag the scandal into the public? And making it sound like her mother had an ongoing sexual relationship with a married man. That's not what happened, and she damn well knew it. Now, what Sally was referring to here was that Loretta and Gable's only sexual encounter was on the train returning from location shooting in Washington State, and Gable forced himself on Loretta. Now, for Pollyanne's comments. My own personal opinion is that something had been working on Judy for a number of years. Judy had not been a successful actress. Her marriage did not work out. And she was not a prominent person, and I think she wanted all that. And I think these were the reasons why she decided to write the book. It was one way of getting the notoriety. You could tell by watching the television screen when she was running around from show to show promoting her book. When I watched her, I was curious to know how she behaved. She loved every moment of it. She was very sure of herself, smiling as though she were thinking, now, all the people are noticing me and who I am. I was shocked when uh, asked on the Larry King show, did your mother ever try a reconciliation? She said, no, never. Well, I knew that wasn't true because I saw her note to Loretta's message, let's have lunch, honey, and talk. Judy responded that she didn't feel that the time was right, but that she'd let her know when she thought it was. How could she deny that that ever happened on Larry King? Now, Sally also shared that Gladys, that's their mother, had a foreshadowing of what was to come shortly before she died at age 96 in 1984. Sally recalled, Mom was staying with Pollyann and Judy had been over. Just by the way that Judy was talking and laughing, Mom sensed that something wasn't right. Later on, she said to me, "You know, dear, I think that Judy's going to cause trouble. Oh, yes, I really think Judy's going to create a big scandal. She's just too insensitive. Thank heavens I won't be alive." What is one to make of all this? Now, I think most people would conclude that Judy had not been well served and being allowed to think that Loretta was her adopted mother, particularly since she didn't really know the truth until she was 31 years old, at least know the truth for sure. Even her aunt and grandmother had pushed for disclosure a decade earlier, but were vetoed by Loretta. Now, reasonable people could have different opinions on whether Judy's need to tell her story, trumped her mother's quest for privacy, and what Loretta saw as scandal, and the possible fallout from the example that it was set. But what was clear to me was that Loretta, her sisters, and even their mother from the grave had circled the wagons after Judy's book came out. Judy was the bad guy. Okay, one last comment. To contact me, visit my website at edwardjfunk.wordpress.com. Thank you very much.